What the heck is going on? For the past week or so now, all I'm seeing is a constant barrage against the Muslim community, particularly the Muslims of the UK. Filthy, disgusting accusations made by people like Elon Musk, who's apparently a genius and the world's richest man, who, to be honest, is acting like a teenage online troll. So what's he been saying? Well, that Muslims in the UK prey on innocent white girls, grooming them with alcohol and drugs and turning them into prostitutes while abusing and raping them. Elon also claims that Tommy Robinson, aka Stephen Yaxi Lennon, is a political prisoner in the UK silenced for exposing the Muslim grooming gangs. Me trying to explain this stuff just sounds absolutely crazy, but it gets worse because Elon Musk began retweeting out British politicians, people like Malcolm Pearson, member of the House of Lords, who claimed that 250,000 women in the UK had been raped mainly by Muslims.
There appear to have been upwards of 250,000 young white girls raped in this century, very largely by Muslim men.
In fact, he, Pearson, went on to quote the Labour MP for Rotherham, Sarah Champion, who made the astonishing claim that it was 1 million women and girls who were raped in the UK, and according to Pearson, this is mainly by Muslims. We are also seeing charts being shared claiming that 80% of rapes in the UK are being undertaken by Pakistanis, aka Muslims. We've also seen parliamentary debates and Prime Minister Question Time debate the whole grooming gangs and why there is no national inquiry into Muslims abusing white girls. So what's going on? What's being claimed? And is there really any merits to these claims? Well, there's three key things that are being claimed. Firstly, Muslims engaged in mass rapes on an industrial scale in the UK, and that Muslims are specifically targeting white non-Muslim women and girls in particular. Secondly, these Muslims are raping and prostituting these girls because they are in part or in whole motivated by Islamic teachings. And thirdly, there's been a massive cover-up by the police and social services and governmental authorities, and the reason for this cover-up is because they fear the Muslim community. They fear being labelled Islamophobic, that Muslims yield such power that the British establishment has cowered in fear. Just speaking out this out loud just sounds utterly stupid. But this is being believed by the average non-Muslim in the UK and around the world, in fact. Let's take each point and show how utterly stupid and false each one is. Firstly, the claim that Muslims are engaged in mass rape on an industrial scale and that they're targeting mainly white people. As I mentioned before, the Labour MP Sarah Champion, who was quoted by Baron Pearson, claimed that 1 million British girls have been raped mainly by Muslims. UK has a population of just under 4 million Muslims, half of which would be male, so around 2 million. Probably a third of them are children, so around 1.5 million adult males account for 1 million rapes of women and girls. I just want you to think about that. The current adult Muslim male population in the UK is probably around about 1.5 million, and some politicians are claiming up to 1 million girls are being raped by these mainly 1.5 million Muslim males. Now, I get it, Brian and Pam from some village in Britain might not know any Muslims and actually think this might be true. You know, you can't trust those foreign-looking Muslims. But you, Muslims in the UK, know Muslims. Those non-Muslims who work or are neighbours or, study with and are friends with Muslims, surely they should know that it doesn't make any sense. Do you really think that 2 million Muslim males, not accounting for the children, would be responsible for 1 million or up to 1 million non-Muslim women and girls being raped? It makes no sense. And even if we take the lesser so-called figure of 250,000, it still makes no sense that 1.5 or 2 million Muslims males would be involved in that. Even if we leave aside the incredulity of these figures and simply ask the question, how did you work out these numbers? How do you get 1 million women that have been raped or 250,000 women have been raped, mainly by Muslims? Over what years are we talking about? What's the time frame are we talking about? Can you even give us a method of how you work this number out? Well, in fact, questions was asked to a fact-finding website called Full Fact, who asked both Sarah Champion MP and Baron Pearson for their claimed figures and how they came to them. Guess what? Sarah Champion, who mentioned the 1 million figure, has now backtracked and said it's completely unreliable. And when Pearson was asked how he came to these extrapolated figures, he refused to answer this question. So you see, you are being fooled. They are bringing these numbers out of their backside and you are swallowing it without any question. Another claim that's being pushed is these charts. It claims that 80% of gang rapes are committed by Pakistanis. It's even being tweeted out by MPs like Richard Tice. This chart looks fake, but sadly idiots, and there's plenty of them around, would probably look at that and think this is national data and that this must be true. It looks fancy. But the chart isn't found in Cockbain 2018. You see, I actually downloaded this research. I read through it and found that it isn't there. It's in fact taken from somebody else has taken it from an actual table 2.1 from the research and then created this particular chart. So why did they create a false chart? Why didn't they just use the actual table from the research itself? Well, that's because the table from the research gives a very different impression than the chart does. Remember, the chart, when seen by an untrained person, people like Elon Musk, might think this refers to national data. The table, however, is clear. It's taken from a selected sample of 6 operations where the number of offenders are 55, and 44 of those 55 offenders were Pakistani. You see, the table isn't about national figures. It's about these 6 operations. It's not about trying to determine which ethnicity is engaged in the most rapes or abuses or gang rapes. It's looking at a specific selected number of cases. And even then, Cockbain, who's at pains to explain in the very same report that you can't use this data to establish a generalized picture about which ethnicity is more likely to engage in abuse. In fact, at the beginning of her research, where this table is found, it clearly states various myths that are false and refutes them. One of which is that there is an attack on white Britain. And secondly, another myth being refuted by her is that this isn't described as an epidemic problem. Remember, claiming 1 million or 250,000 white girls being raped by mainly Muslims is considered some sort of epidemic, or trying to give this impression that it's an epidemic problem. Yet this report, it actually states the statistical evidence cited to support such claims, i.e. that this is an epidemic situation, was unconvincing. As serious as the offences in question were, the 17 cases identified hardly constitute an epidemic threat. Cockbain 2013. That quote was from a previous report that Cockbain actually herself produced on this issue of grooming gangs. And I just want you to think about this. The very report being used to create these deceptive charts, and the very author of this report has stated very clearly that you can't make any claims about Pakistanis or any other specific ethnicity that are engaged disproportionately in crimes of sexual abuse. She's also stating very clearly that this isn't an attack on white Britain, and also that this isn't an epidemic problem affecting Britain. It's the very opposite of these racist Islamophobes that have been trying to claim while using this report and her research. It's pure manipulation, and to be honest, it's just blatantly lies. But it gets worse, because we do have large and officially collected data, including ethnicities, in 70% of the convictions of child sexual abuse cases. So we know at least 70% of cases the ethnicities of the perpetrators, and guess which ethnicity is at the top, perpetrating the most child sexual abuse? Yes, it's white population in Britain, who account for almost 90% of child sexual abuse cases, including rape, grooming, taking and sharing indecent images of children. So it's just mad, isn't it, that you can check this quite easily for yourself. The claim that Muslims are overrepresented, that white girls are being preyed upon, etc., etc. White Britain is being under attack from Muslim predators, yet the vast majority of child sexual abusers are white. They are in fact overrepresented in convictions. Asians are in fact underrepresented according to this data, meaning Asians, which invariably would include Muslims, are disproportionately less likely to commit sexual abuse against children compared to their population numbers. Let me repeat. Asians, including Muslims, comparing their population, which is 9% in the UK, are disproportionately less likely to sexually abuse children, and white are disproportionately more likely to commit sexual abuse against children. That should be case closed, shouldn't it? No more to discuss. Even Dr. Ella Cockbain, you know, the one who wrote the report that the far right love to use that misleading chart from, even she wrote in 2019, it's crucial to look at the bigger picture. Court data show Asians weren't overrepresented from among roughly 172,000 men and 27,000 women convicted of any sexual offence in England and Wales in 2016. More specifically, Asians were actually underrepresented at 4%. Note that we have almost 200,000 convictions of sexual abuse and sexual offences in England and Wales. So even when we talk about 44 Asian abusers who were convicted of a crime that spans over 10 years or more, that would equate to approximately 2 million sexual offences that would have taken place in the same period of about 10 years. Actually, that's an underestimate because the majority of sexual offences go unreported and don't result in convictions. The point is, you can't make a generalisation of a subset of a type of sexual offence like street grooming, which by the way isn't even recognised as having a legal definition, and then use these few hundred offenders to make a broad generalisation of millions of Muslims. In fact, as Sky News has reported that according to the NSPCC, that's the National Society for the Prevention of Cruelty of Children, that even if we take the subset of group-based sexual abuse, that the vast majority of abusers are white. It states figures from police database show where ethnicity is recorded that in the first 3 quarters of 2024, 85% of group-based child abusers were white, while 3.9% were Pakistani in origin. Remember also, this is only looking at a subset of all sexual abuse cases against children. That's only 3.5% of all sexual abuse cases against children that are defined as group-based child abuse. Of that 3.5%, only 3.9% will be Pakistani background. That, by the way, calculates to 38 cases in the 3rd quarter of last year were Pakistanis, while the overall number of child abuse offences in that same period was 28,556. Now let me make it 100% clear. One case of child abuse is abhorrent, disgusting, and the perpetrators should have the harshest of sentences. But this isn't about the disgusting actions of these individuals, but how these individuals are being presented as a representation of the actions of all Pakistani and Muslims in general. That they, the Pakistanis and Muslims, are behind the majority of abuses of women and girls. But the figures just don't simply stack up. How can you then take 38 cases involving Pakistanis and then make a generalization about Islam and Muslims? It's simply statistically impossible to make these type of generalization claims. But that doesn't stop some of these non-Muslims making these spurious claims. In fact, they attempt to claim that it's Islam and the Islamic culture that promotes the idea that Muslim men can rape and abuse non-Muslim women and girls. It sounds stupid. Every Muslim knows that alcohol, drugs, prostitution, adultery and fornication are grave crimes in Islam. Yet somehow the wider non-Muslims are being groomed into believing that this is being promoted by Islam, because this is what these abusers did. They plied them with alcohol and drugs, prostituted them, committed adultery and fornication, raped them and abused them. So how can any of this be considered a promotion by Islam when all of this is considered absolutely evil and abhorrent under Islam? Come on, think about it. Muslims are taught that we're meant to lower our gaze when looking at the opposite gender. That adultery is a crime in Islam that carries a very harsh penalties in this life under a Sharia government, and even harsher punishment in the next life. And it doesn't matter whether this abuse is against Muslims or non-Muslim girls. The same ruling applies. It's totally forbidden, just like drinking alcohol or taking drugs. In fact, the crime is considered worse in Islam to abuse women and girls than to drink alcohol and take drugs. Yet what's ironic is that there's never been a debate about white culture and what's the problem, even though the majority of abusers are white. There's never been a debate about Christianity, even though there is decades of systemic abuse that have been covered up by the church to cover up cases of priests and nuns abusing children and boys. For instance, in France alone, over a 70-year period, some 216,000 children were abused in the church. In Spain, the figure is 200,000. In Italy, the cases of abuse by the church exceeds even these numbers and is considered perhaps the highest in any part of the world. In the UK, we recently seen the resignation of the Archbishop of Canterbury over an abuse scandal, failing to report or failing to engage to stop sexual abuse that was taking place. In fact, there are reports of the Church of England forgiving paedophiles and letting them continue working with children. But while the debate is skewed towards attacking Muslims, who form a tiny minority of the cases, and while we have a wholesale of sexual abuse of children in churches across the world, including the UK, we see there's no debate, no discussion about what's wrong in Christianity. Why are white Christians abusing girls and boys? As Marai Larassi, the director of IMCAN and the co-chair of the End Violence Against Women coalition stated, an excessive focus on some cases of sexual exploitation with a primary focus on ethnicity rather than the exploitation itself is misleading and fuels racist attitudes which ultimately won't help women and girls. Nazir Afzal, who is responsible for bringing the perpetrators of grooming gangs to trial, told The Guardian it wasn't the race that defined them, it was their treatment of women. And he also added, there is no community where women and girls are not vulnerable to sexual attack, and that's a fact. So why is there an excessive focus on immigrants, Islam and Muslims? Firstly, the West seeks to divert attention from their own failings and their own culture that creates abuse to point towards the minorities, saying it's their issue, it's their problem, they're the reason. They're implying that if it weren't for those pesky Muslims and foreigners, we'd have such a peaceful and civilized society and our children will be free from sexual abuse. Mate, look at the abuses that have taken place by the likes of Jimmy Savile, Max Clifford, a host of MPs, not to mention the thousands of white abusers in your own country. There's something rotten at the heart of your decadent ideology that commoditizes sex and objectifies women and girls. It's something that even affects the church and Christianity. A society that promotes the idea that OnlyFans is a valid career move for girls, literally prostituting themselves online. An ideology that created the incel type culture, as UK Good Childhood Inquiry concluded that abuses against children were the results of beliefs of excessive individualism and that the primary duty of the individual is to make the most of their own life. Toxic ideas like individualism and the means to happiness is sensual gratification, which underpins capitalism, causes these very problems that sadly infects everybody within society, even those with Muslim sounding names. But by focusing on the race or the religion of the minority, all these self-questioning about why Western societies have failed children, they are all ignored, and instead the focus is put upon the blame of, the fault of the Muslims and the minorities and foreigners. It's really pathetic. Secondly, Elon Musk demonized the Muslims as a way to deflect criticism from his H-1B visa fiasco, where he lost support from his traditional right-wing supporters when he implied American workers were lazy and stupid and that's why he needed Indian workers from abroad. Thirdly, Elon Musk is also part of the American political establishment, now having joined Trump's government. And Trump's government is more than happy to rile up the right in the UK to attack the Labour left-leaning government, pushing what they think will be a more right-leaning society, will be more likely to engage with America over the EU. It's a political tactic. Fourthly, with the Zionists attempting to demonize Islam and Muslims, they think this will help them carry on with their genocide in Gaza, justify them committing and engaging in abhorrent war crimes because it's against those barbaric Muslims. They see this as dehumanizing the Muslims creates such hatred against them that their crimes, either Zionist crimes, will be ignored, if not in fact applauded by the West. That is what it's about, these 4 points. Manipulation, lying, deceit by the powerful, manipulate the ordinary, wider, non-Muslim white population who form the majority of the society. And ultimately, this will not address the real issue. That is the protection of our most vulnerable in society, i.e. children, from predatory abusers. See, none of these manipulators are actually concerned about abuse victims. They just want to politicize it for their own selfish agenda.